The Fenn Ranch did not announce itself to anyone. You had to earn it. You had to climb a switchback trail that wound upward through stands of blue spruce and lodgepole pine, past boulders the size of barns along a creek so cold in November that its edges had already gone to ice. Then, only then, after the trail bent one final time around a granite shoulder, the ranch appeared below you like a secret the mountain had been keeping. The main house was long and low-hewn from pine logs that had gone dark with years of weather. Its chimney breathed a steady thread of gray smoke into a pewter sky. Behind it stood a barn that could shelter 12 horses with room to spare a tack room, with its own forge, two hay buildings, and a chicken coop that had outlasted harder winters than this one promised to be. By the measure of Copper Ridge County, the Fenn brothers were men of standing. By the measure of everything that stood around them, those vast and different peaks and the silence that lived between them, they were three men in a very large wilderness, which amounted to the same thing said differently. Harlan Fenn was the first one up that morning, as he was every morning. He moved through the kitchen before the sky had decided what color it intended to be, before the fire in the grate had committed to living. He was 40 years old, and his size was not the size of a young man who had never stopped growing. It was something more permanent. The mountain had that quality too, a settled weight that did not announce itself but simply was. His face carried the weather of a decade spent outdoors. His jaw was a straight line. His eyes were the color of old honey, focused and deliberate, the kind of eyes that read a situation the way other men read a page quickly and without missing anything. He set the coffee pot on. He checked the window. The sky to the northwest had gone the color of a bruise, that thick, yellowish quality that men who lived at altitude recognized not as weather but as a verdict. Snow was coming, the serious kind, the kind that did not ask permission. He exhaled through his nose and picked up the letter from the shelf where he had been keeping it for 3 weeks, reading it for what he knew was the 6th time. The Weston Matrimonial Agency out of Philadelphia. Miss Nell Hale, aged 19 years, of sound character and capable hands, daughter of the late Mr. William Hale Master Sadler, formerly of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. She had accepted the arrangement. She would travel by rail to Denver and from there by stagecoach to Harlow Creek, arriving in the first or second week of November. This was the second week of November. Harlan had written to the agency 14 months ago. He had done it on a night when the silence in this house had acquired a particular weight that he could not account for with weather or exhaustion or the long accumulating effects of isolation. He was not a man who acted on feelings without examination. He had examined this feeling for a long time before he reached for the paper. What he found after all that examination was not loneliness exactly, though loneliness was part of it. It was something more like incompleteness. 3 men and their work and their 7 years of labor had produced something real and solid and worth being proud of. But there were evenings when he looked at the 3 plates on the table and thought that the thing they had built was missing something that could not be hammered into place. So he had written the letter. He had been practical and honest in it, as he was practical and honest in everything. He had described the land, the work, the winters. He had not made promises beyond what the land could keep. And he had waited. He had told Ira the day the reply came. That conversation, if it could be called a conversation, had consisted of Harlan saying that a woman was coming in the fall, and Ira looking at him from across the barn with those still amber eyes for a long moment, and then returning to the cinch he was tightening. Bram had produced 14 questions in rapid succession, all of which Harlan had answered with the minimum information necessary. They had made adjustments to the house, a new latch on the bedroom door, fresh curtaining for the window, a proper mirror above the washstand which Bram had located in Harlow Creek and transported up the mountain with more care than he gave most things. Now Harlan set the letter back on the shelf and made his decision. He needed to ride into Harlow Creek for the winter supply order, a task he had been deferring for 2 weeks. The window before the storm closed was perhaps 3 hours. He could reach town and return part way before the weather shut the pass. He would leave Ira and Bram to receive Miss Hale if she arrived early. He did not love this arrangement. The letter had said first or second week, not a specific date. He allowed himself the reasonable interpretation that she would not arrive today of all days in the face of an incoming blizzard ahead of schedule. He wrote a note. He left it on the kitchen table. He saddled his horse in the dark of the barn, pulled on his long canvas duster, and rode down off the mountain in the yellowed morning light without waking his brothers. That note said 4 things: town for supplies, storm incoming, may have company, be decent. The last two words were underlined. Ira Fenn lay in his bunk and listened to his brother's horse descend the trail until the sound dissolved into the wind in the pines. Then he lay there a while longer, staring at the ceiling. There was a knot in the third board from the left that had been looking back at him for 7 years. He was 36 years old. He had lived nowhere but this mountain since he was 29, and before that, 3 years as a cavalry scout moving through country that had asked things of him he did not discuss and which had left their mark on him in ways that were not always visible from the outside. The mountain had suited him from the first season. It was honest. It did not pretend to be less dangerous than it was or more forgiving than it intended to be. The distances were real distances. The cold was real cold. A man who did his work carefully and paid attention to what the land was telling him could live here well, and Ira Fenn had always been that kind of man. He had not argued against Harlan's decision about the matrimonial agency. He had not pushed for it either. He had simply returned to his work, which was what he did when a thing had been said that needed time to settle before it could be understood clearly. Over the months since Harlan's announcement, what had settled in him was not objection. It was something more like a low-level awareness, the way you are aware of weather building on the horizon before you can name what kind of weather it will be. He rose. He dressed. He went to the kitchen, read the note twice, poured coffee without speaking, because there was no one to speak to. Bram appeared from his room, still tucking his shirt in hair, achieving its customary state of independent ambition, eyes sharp despite the hour. 29 years old, their father's coloring lighter hair, and a quicker mouth and a mind that approached problems from the side rather than straight on. He had spent a year working as a bookkeeper in the Denver land office before concluding that cities were places worth having come from. He read the note. He looked at Ira. "So we are receiving the bride," Bram said. "Looks that way." "I know nothing about receiving brides." "Behave like a civilized person." Bram considered this with evident skepticism regarding his own capacity for it. But he was already moving toward the window, already reading the sky with the instinctive attention of a man who had spent years at altitude. "If they ran that stage out of Denver this morning," he said, "the driver had more courage than sense." Ira set down his cup, or Miss Hale did. They looked at each other. Then Ira went to saddle his horse, just in case. Nell Hale did not understand how cold she truly was until the cold had already made its decisions about her. She had been on the stagecoach from Denver for 11 hours. The driver had suggested 4. She had spent those 11 hours watching the country change through a rattling window, the flat, frost-bitten plains giving way to the first great blue shoulders of the Rocky Mountains, those shoulders growing until they were not background anymore, but walls, the sky compressing between them, everything narrowing to the road ahead. She was 19 years old. She had her mother's green eyes and her father's hands strong and capable and built for work. She had grown up in the back of a leather shop on Millbrook Street in Pittsburgh, doing her schoolwork on an upturned crate, while her father worked learning the craft by watching and then by doing, understanding the patience required to bring a piece of rawhide to something beautiful and durable. She knew the smell of neat's foot oil and tannin the way other girls knew the smell of their mother's kitchens. She could cut a saddle seat pattern before she was 15. She could braid a rein by feel in the dark before she was 12. She shared the coach with a hardware merchant bound for Harlow Creek and a widow in black who had not said a word for the entire journey and showed no interest in beginning. Nell had used the time to think, which was something she had been doing with great intensity for the past 7 months and which had not yet arrived at any comfortable conclusions. Her father had died in March. William Hale had been a quiet man and a careful one with a craftsman's precision about everything he touched, and a craftsman's reluctance to speak about what he did not understand. He had run the leather shop on Millbrook Street for 20 years, and Nell had grown up assuming the shop would always be there and he would always be in it. Then 2 years before the end, something changed. Men began appearing at the shop after closing time, men she was not introduced to, men whose voices she heard through the floor of the apartment above as she lay awake trying to understand what was happening downstairs. Her father grew quieter than his natural quiet. The lines around his eyes deepened with something that was not an age. When she asked him what was wrong, he said it was business. When she asked what kind of business, he said the kind a man managed on his own. He told her 2 things in the last weeks. He told her not to trust a man who came to her using the name Cruz. And he told her that if a man named Aldrich Cruz himself came to the door, she should take what she needed and go. She had held those words in her chest like stones for the 3 weeks after his death, too busy with the necessary machinery of loss to properly examine them. Then the knock came at the shop door. Aldrich Cruz was tall and dressed well, and had the kind of deliberate calm about him that certain powerful men cultivate, a surface so smooth and managed that you could not find the edge of it. He walked with a slight favor to his right leg, barely perceptible. His eyes were small and moved constantly, taking inventory of everything in the room simultaneously. He had told her that her father owed him a considerable debt, that the shop's assets would not cover it, and that they would need to come to an arrangement regarding an alternative settlement. He had asked about a ledger. She had said she did not know of any ledger. She had kept her voice even when she said it. He had looked at her with those small, moving eyes, and in that look was something that had nothing to do with debt collection. It was the look of a man assessing an asset, calculating its value, deciding how it might be used. She had found the ledger that same night, hidden in the hollow back of her father's workbench, exactly where a man would put something he needed to keep close, but needed no one else to find. A slim book covered in oilcloth, columns and figures and dates and initials in her father's careful hand. She had not understood most of what she was looking at. She had understood enough to know that she should not leave it behind. She had answered Harlan Fenn's advertisement 2 weeks later, chosen from a 6-week-old copy of the Denver paper she had found in a bundle her father kept. She had been honest with the Weston agency about her circumstances. She had not been honest about her reasons for wanting to go so far west so quickly. She was not running away. She had decided on this distinction and held it carefully. She was running towards something, toward a man's honest letter and a ranch in the mountains and work she already knew how to do. The fact that she was also running away from Aldrich Cruz was a separate matter, she told herself, and believed it approximately 70% of the time. The stagecoach stopped at a crossroads marker 2.5 miles below the turnoff for the Fenn Ranch. The driver climbed down from his box and delivered the information without apology. The road ahead was icing faster than he was willing to risk his animals on. He was turning back to the last way station. Anyone who needed to continue could do so on foot. The hardware merchant calculated his options for approximately 4 seconds and decided to ride back with the driver. The widow in black made the same decision without looking at Nell. Nell stood at the side of the road and watched the stagecoach disappear into the building whiteness. She stood there for 30 seconds, which was how long it took her to arrive at the only decision available to her. She opened her trunk, layered every piece of clothing she could wear onto her body, pulled her father's old oilskin coat over all of it, tucked her leather satchel flat against her ribs beneath the coat, and latched the trunk. She would come back for it, or she would not. The ledger was against her body, which was the only thing that mattered. 2.5 miles. She had walked longer distances than that in Pittsburgh on ordinary days. She began to walk. The snow was cooperative for the first mile, which is to say it fell straight down. Then the wind found the trail and everything changed. It came off the mountain in sustained horizontal sheets, driving ice crystals against her face like thrown gravel. The spruce trees on either side of the path bent under it. She pulled the oilskin hood lower and put her head down and kept moving. She counted her steps. She counted them in groups of 50, then of 20, then of 10, because smaller numbers were more manageable and she needed to manage. Her feet went numb past the ankle before she had covered the first half-mile. Her fingers inside their gloves stopped reporting useful information about the world not long after. The cold at this altitude was not the cold she had known in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh cold was an inconvenience, something you passed through quickly on your way to warmth. This cold had a different quality entirely. It had patience. It was not interested in inconveniencing her. It was interested in stopping her. She had a kind of stubbornness that had come down through her father's bloodline, the quiet, persistent variety that did not announce itself in argument or drama, but simply refused to stop doing what it had decided to do. It was the most useful thing he had left her, more useful even than the craft, because the craft required tools and a bench and material, while this required nothing at all. She carried it up the trail. She did not see the fork in the path because the snow had filled it level. She took the left branch without knowing it was wrong and walked on for another quarter-mile before the trail dissolved into open slope, and she heard below her, somewhere in the white, the thick, particular silence of water moving under ice. She stopped. The wind hit her full in the face. She turned. The trail had disappeared behind her. There was nothing in any direction but white. Not fog, not darkness, just white total and complete, the color of a world that had decided to erase itself. Nell Hale sat down in the snow. Not in defeat, not quite. More in the way that a body overrules the mind when the mind has been pushing too hard for too long. She wrapped her arms around the satchel beneath the coat and kept her eyes open because she understood that closing them was the one thing she absolutely could not do. She looked at the white world around her and thought with a clarity that surprised her, I am in serious trouble. She thought about Harlan Fenn's letter. She had read it so many times on the train that she nearly had it memorized. A practical arrangement for a practical woman he had written. The land is hard and the winters are long, but what we have built here is honest, and I am an honest man. She had believed him reading it. She still believed him now, sitting in the snow, with the cold making its decisions about her joints and her extremities. She just needed to not freeze to death before she could confirm it in person. Something large and warm materialized from the white. A horse, dark coat breath smoking in clouds from its nostrils, moving with the careful, deliberate steps of an animal navigating unsure ground. Its rider was already swinging down before it stopped, boots striking the snow with a sound she felt more than heard that close. He crouched directly in front of her. He was large in the way that her father's heavy workbench had been large, a solidity that did not announce itself with noise or movement, but was simply their unmovable presence. His face was weathered and angular, the jaw carrying 3 or 4 days of stubble that had gone past dark blonde towards something rougher. His eyes were amber in color, the steady kind that read a situation and did not waste time on panic. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has decided to take responsibility for. "Can you stand?" he asked. His voice was low and direct, shaped to carry over wind without shouting. She looked at him. "I think so," she said. "Don't think, try." She tried. Her legs produced something that approximated standing. He had a hand beneath her arm before she had finished, deciding to accept the help, not gripping hard, just present, an anchor point. He took the satchel from her other arm in the same motion. She started to object. He was already moving toward the horse. He lifted her into the saddle with a single efficient motion, no ceremony, no wasted effort, and swung up behind her so smoothly that the horse shifted only slightly. His arms came around her on either side, not an embrace, just the necessary geometry of keeping her from sliding, and he turned the horse back into the white. She was shaking hard enough to feel it in her back teeth. He said nothing. After a long minute, she said, "I am Nell Hale." A pause. "Ira Fenn," he said. Another pause shorter. "I was meant for Harlan Fenn." "I know," he said. "He is not here." The ranch house emerged from the blizzard the way a lighthouse emerges from fog, first the warm yellow square of a lit window, then the dark mass of the porch, then the smell of pine smoke, and finally the solid percussion of hooves on frozen porch boards. Ira dismounted and lifted her down without asking. He pushed the door open with his shoulder, and the warmth of the house hit her like something physical, a wall of it, and she stood in the doorway for a moment and let it reach her. She had not fully understood how cold she had become until warmth was available. Now the cold announced itself everywhere at once. The room was low-ceilinged and wide hearth and lit by a fire burning well. A table, a bench, 3 chairs. Everything was clean and nothing was ornamental. The walls held tools and rope, and one calendar, and one framed photograph of 3 boys standing in front of a tree, nothing else. It was a house that had been lived in by working men who believed that a thing's presence ought to justify itself. She found this unexpectedly settling. She was tired of things that pretended to be other than what they were. A younger man appeared from the back of the house, lighter-haired than Ira, a face built for expression, currently registering something between surprise and genuine pleasure. He assessed the scene in about 1.5 seconds. "Found her, Ira said. It was both unnecessary and completely sufficient." "I can see that." The younger man was already moving. "Blankets. Put her by the fire. I will get blankets and something hot." He disappeared. Ira guided her toward the chair closest to the hearth. Not by the arm, just by the simple logic of his movement, stepping in a direction and trusting that she would follow, which she did. He pulled the chair closer to the fire. He went to the kitchen and came back with a tin mug of coffee wrapped in a cloth because it was too hot to hold otherwise. She took it in both hands and felt the heat travel up her forearms like a slow tide. She looked at the fire. She looked at him. He stood several feet back, watching her with those amber eyes. Not hovering, not intruding, just present the way a man is present when he has taken responsibility for something and intends to see it through. His coat was still on. His hat was in his hand. He had ridden into a whiteout blizzard for a woman he had never met, and he was soaked from the shoulders down, and he was standing there as though this were simply the next task after the previous one. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. The younger brother came back with 2 wool blankets, arranging them around her shoulders, with considerably more fuss than was strictly necessary, accompanying the process with an unbroken commentary on the general inadequacy of stage lines that ran coaches in November, theoretical philosophy of turning back when weather turned serious, and the specific amenities the house could offer a guest with cold-related complaints. His name was Bram. He shook her hand with formal seriousness after the blankets were arranged, as though this were a perfectly ordinary introduction and not a situation that had begun with her sitting in a snowdrift. For the first time in months, she almost laughed. "Harlan is in town," Bram told her. "Supply run. He left before the storm moved in. He will come back as soon as the pass road clears, which," he looked at the window, "will not be until morning at the earliest." "Then I arrived a day before he expected me," she said. "At least." Bram settled onto the bench across from her. The agency letter said first or second week. He estimated the 15th at the latest. She looked at Ira. He was still standing. He had not moved or changed expression. He met her eyes briefly and then looked at the window. "You should change," she said to him. "You are wet through." A short pause. Something moved in his expression that she could not quite identify there and gone. "I will see to the horse," he said, and walked back out into the storm. She watched the door close. She looked at Bram. He was watching her with that quick, warm, noticing attention, the kind that filed things away without seeming to. "Is he always like that?" she asked. "Like what exactly? Quiet?" Bram considered this with the air of a man who has given the subject considerable thought. "He speaks when he has something to say. It simply does not happen often." He tilted his head. "But he rode out into a complete whiteout to find you. Harlan left no instructions for that. That was a decision Ira made on his own." She held the hot mug. She did not know what to say about that, so she said nothing. The storm settled over the mountain and stayed. The wind drove snow against the windows in sustained sheets, and the temperature dropped toward the kind of cold that made the timbers of the house speak in small cracking voices. Inside, the fire held. Bram made a stew from venison and dried corn that was better than anything the journey had led her to expect. They ate at the table, all 3 of them, because Ira had come back in from the barn, changed and dry, and had settled into the kitchen with the quiet efficiency of a man who did not need conversation to participate in an evening. Bram asked her careful questions about the journey, the train in Denver, and the stagecoach, and she answered with equal care, giving information without giving much. She was 19 years old in a house with 2 men she had met hours ago in a country she did not know, and the man she had agreed to marry was not yet home. She was aware of all of this. She was also aware that Ira Fenn sat across the table and said almost nothing through the meal, but that he refilled her water cup without being asked, and that when his eyes rested on her, they had a quality of attention that was neither intrusive nor absent, simply present the way a man watches something that has begun to matter to him. She filed this observation alongside the others and did not examine it further. After Bram went out to check the animals in the barn, Nell sat by the fire and could not sleep. She was tired in every layer of herself and could not sleep anyway, which was a condition she recognized from the weeks after her father died. Her body was too aware of everything to release it. She reached into the satchel beside her chair and took out the ledger. She set it on her knees and opened it to the middle and looked at it in the firelight, the way she had looked at it a dozen times since Pittsburgh, hoping that repetition would eventually convert obscurity into clarity. Her father's handwriting filled the columns. Careful, deliberate, the same hand that had written supply orders and customer receipts for 20 years. Numbers, dates, initials repeated in patterns ACDS, other letters she did not recognize, transactions perhaps, or payments, or something else entirely. The land register numbers written in a different hand in pencil added after the original ink. County names Larimer Weld. And then near the back in writing, that was her father's hand, but shaken unsteady, entirely, unlike the precise, careful columns, 3 words followed by his initials. 3 shots fired. WH. And below that circled twice in black ink, so heavy the pen had nearly gone through the page, April 14th, 1872. She did not know what she was looking at. She knew it frightened her. A footstep. She closed the ledger. Ira stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the main room, not sneaking, simply there, the way men of his particular kind of stillness tended to be there without announcing it. He carried a second mug of coffee. He set it on the low table beside her chair without speaking and sat down in the chair across the hearth. He did not ask about the ledger. He did not ask about anything. They sat in the firelight without talking, and the silence between them was not the silence of two strangers without a subject. It was something different from that. She had grown up in a city of specific noises, ironworks, and river traffic, and the social obligation to fill every pause with something, anything, because silence in company was considered a failure. She had learned to fill silences. She had never entirely believed the filling was necessary. After a while, she said, "Why did you ride out?" He looked at the fire, could not see a person in the snow, and stay inside. Bram said Harlan left no instructions to. He did not. Then why? He was quiet long enough that she thought the question was going to go unanswered. Then he said, "Some things do not need instructions." She looked at him. He looked at the fire. She turned to look at the fire too, another stretch of silence. Then she said quietly, "My father used to say that a man's real character is what he does when there is no rule telling him what to do." Ira said nothing, but the quality of his silence shifted in a way she recognized as having heard. She went to bed in the room with the new latch and the mirror. She lay on her back in the darkness and listened to the storm, and thought about the circled date in her father's shaking handwriting, and about a man with steady amber eyes who rode into blizzards without being asked, and about the fact that she had traveled 4 days to meet a man she had never met, and had found herself instead sitting by a fire with his brother. She did not regret the direction she had traveled. That surprised her. Given everything, given the cold and the ledger, and the danger she was carrying, and the complicated situation she was walking into, she lay in a stranger's house on a Colorado mountain and did not regret it. She thought that probably meant something, though she could not yet say exactly what. Morning came pale and clear, the blizzard done, the world remade in white. Nell was out of bed before either brother. She found the kitchen and started the fire, and located coffee and bread from the previous day's loaf, and by the time she heard movement from the far end of the house, she had the table laid and the coffee steaming. Bram appeared in the kitchen doorway, stopped and looked at the table with the expression of a man who has unexpectedly encountered something worth celebrating. "You made breakfast," he said. "My father taught me that the person who makes the coffee owns the morning. Sit down." Ira appeared behind him. He looked at the table. He looked at her. He said nothing, but he sat down in the chair nearest the window, the one with the longest sight line to the trail, without making any particular point of it. She ate with them. They moved through the morning with the comfort of long-established habit, Bram doing most of the talking, Ira occasionally dropping a single sentence that shifted the conversation's direction without fanfare. She watched the way they occupied the house together, the small choreography of men who had shared a space long enough to stop noticing their own efficiency, and she felt the particular aloneness of a person newly arrived inside a system that had been running without them. She would learn it. She was a fast learner. After breakfast, she asked what needed doing. Bram looked surprised. Ira picked up a basket of torn harness leather from beside the kitchen shelf and set it on the table in front of her without comment. She pulled her father's tools from the bottom of the satchel, the only possessions she had refused to leave behind, besides the ledger itself, and set to work. Her hands knew what to do. 7 years of the shop lived in them, every lesson her father had given, every correction. Every afternoon spent learning why the grain runs this direction and not that one, and why the tool must follow it. The smell of the leather was the smell of her whole childhood, and here in this strange house on this strange mountain, it reached into her and steadied something that had been very unsteady for a long time. Ira sat across the table with a rifle he was oiling, working with the same unhurried precision. An hour passed without either of them saying anything, and it was not an uncomfortable hour. She thought, "I do not know what I am walking into. I only know I am not going back." The sound of hoofbeats on the cleared trail reached the house around mid-morning. Not Harlan's horse. The rhythm was wrong, and she had already begun without deciding to learn the rhythms of this place. Ira was up and at the window in a single motion that looked unhurried, but covered the ground very quickly. He looked for 2 seconds. Then he moved to the door with the deliberate calm that she was beginning to understand did not mean slow. It meant that he did not waste motion on alarm. She stayed at the table. She heard voices on the porch, Ira's and one she did not recognize. She went on working. Her hands did not waver. Ira came back in. He sat down. He picked up the rifle and the cloth and resumed his work. After a moment, he said without looking up, "Luther Prine, sheriff of Harlow Creek. He was riding circuit, got caught by the storm sheltered in town last night. He came to see Harlan. Harlan is not here." I told him that. A pause, she looked up. He was looking at the rifle, not at her. His jaw had taken on a tightness that had not been there before the sheriff arrived. "He had a message," Ira said. "Two men rode into Harlow Creek yesterday evening, just before the storm closed the South Road. They were asking about a young woman traveling west from Denver. East Coast manner of speaking, blonde hair, traveling alone carrying a leather satchel. The bread she had eaten for breakfast settled differently in her stomach. She put down the piece of harness she was working on. She kept her voice level. He described me. Fairly exactly." Ira looked up. His amber eyes were direct and serious and not unkind. "Prine says they did not state their business, but the questions they were asking were not the questions of men looking for a missing family member." She looked at the satchel on the floor beside her chair. She looked at her hands, leather-stained, her father's hands in miniature, doing her father's work at a table that was not yet hers, in a house that was not yet home. She said quietly, "No, they would not be." Ira looked at her for a moment longer. Then, with the patience of a man who has learned that some things arrive in their own time and cannot be hurried whenever you are ready, and he went back to the rifle. She sat with the harness in her lap and the fire at her back, and the weight of everything she was carrying pressing down on her with a new specificity. They had followed her. She had known they might. She had hoped the distance would be enough, or the mountains, or the simple difficulty of finding one woman in all this space. She had built that hope carefully and maintained it across 2,000 miles of rail and stage road. Now she looked at the leather satchel and at the man working quietly across the table and at the morning light on the snow outside the window, and she understood that the hoping part was finished. What came next would require something other than hope. Ira Fenn did not push. He did not ask again. He oiled the rifle with the same steady attention he appeared to give everything, and the fire breathed behind her, and outside the mountain waited with its usual absence of opinion, enormous and patient and indifferent to what she decided. That indifference she thought was its own kind of comfort. The mountain did not care. That meant the choice was entirely hers. She set the harness aside and began to talk. She told them that evening. Bram had come in from the stock work cold and cheerful and found the quality of the air in the kitchen entirely changed the way air changes in a room where something has been decided. He sat down without being asked and settled into listening the way men settle into something they know will require their full attention. Nell sat at the table with her hands flat on the oilcloth and told them the shape of it. The leather shop on Millbrook Street. The men who came after closing time in the last 2 years of her father's life. His increasing silence, the new lines around his eyes, the way he moved through his work with a different quality of attention, the attention of a man watching where he put his feet near something that could give way. His death in March. The knock at the shop door 1 week later. She told it plainly and in order, without embellishment, the way her father had taught her to account for things. This happened, then this, then this. "He told me the ledger was a business record," she said. "He said my father had owed him money over a period of years, and that the ledger documented that debt, and that he needed it to properly calculate the estate's obligations to him." She paused. "But he already knew my father had died. He knew before the funeral notice ran in the paper. He came 3 days after the death, which meant someone had been watching the shop. And the way he looked at me when he asked about the ledger." She stopped again. It was not the look of a man with a financial concern. Bram said, "Did you have the ledger at that point?" "No, I found it that same night, in the hollow back of my father's workbench, exactly where a man would put something he needed to keep but could not let anyone see." She reached into the satchel beside her chair and set the ledger on the table. Both brothers looked at it. Neither reached for it immediately as though they understood. that it was the kind of object that deserved a moment of consideration before it was touched. She opened it and turned it toward them. Bram picked it up with the careful attention of a man who has handled documents that mattered, which he had during his year in the Denver land office. He turned the pages slowly. His face, usually as readable as large print, went still and careful in the way it went when he was thinking harder than he was showing. Ira watched his brother. Bram turned 3 pages. He turned back. He put his finger on a column of figures and read down it. He examined the penciled land numbers. He read the county names. Then he turned to the back of the books, to the pages where the handwriting changed character, and he read those pages with a stillness that was different from his ordinary stillness. After a moment, he stood up and walked out onto the porch and stayed there for 3 minutes in the cold. Then he came back in and sat down. He looked at Nell. "Your father's initials," he said, "WH. They appear throughout. He kept this record himself." "That is his handwriting, yes." "And AC." Bram set his finger on the initials. "Aldridge Cruz." "That is what I assumed." "DS would be whoever does his physical work, a second man." Bram looked at Ira across the table. Then he turned back to Nell. "Miss Hale, when your father died, did anyone from law enforcement come to see you? A federal officer? Anyone from outside the city?" She thought about it. "No, only Cruz." Bram turned to the back pages again. He read the 3 shaking words in the circled date. He read them twice. "Do you know what happened on April 14th of last year?" "I know those words are in my father's handwriting. I know the date was circled as though it mattered above all the others. I know he did not write like that normally." His hands were very steady. Bram set the ledger down with the care of a man setting down something that might break or might break something else if mishandled. He looked at Ira again, and this time the look between them carried the weight of something being confirmed rather than discovered. "There was a federal marshal operating out of Denver through the late spring of last year," Bram said slowly. "His name was Raymond Calder. He was investigating illegal arms trafficking along the southern trade routes, specifically a network moving rifles and ammunition across the territorial line under cover of legitimate freight hauling. He disappeared in the spring of 1872. His office filed a missing person report that summer. His body was never found." Bram touched the circled date. April 14th, 1872. Nell looked at the date. She looked at the 3 words in her father's shaking hand. 3 shots fired. "My father," she said and stopped. "Your father made a delivery that day," Bram said. "A legitimate one, presumably. Saddle gear or leather goods, the kind of thing he would have been hired to transport to any number of locations along those routes. And at whatever location he delivered to, he witnessed something." Bram's voice had gone very quiet. "He witnessed Aldridge Cruz order the killing of a federal law enforcement officer. And he wrote it down. Everything he saw, the date, the initials of the men involved, the fact of what happened. And he hid it in the back of his workbench and did not tell anyone because the man he had witnessed was not the kind of man you reported to the local police and expected justice. He was the kind of man who owned the local police." No one spoke. The fire said what it always said, the low, steady language of combustion, patient and without opinion. Nell sat with this for a long moment. She thought about the last 2 years of her father's life, the visitors after closing time, the new quality of fear in his eyes, the way he had moved through his familiar work as though the ground beneath it had changed its nature. He had seen something he could not unsee and could not report and could not forget, and he had carried it for a year and a half in the hollow back of a workbench, hoping, she supposed, that Cruz would never connect the delivery man at that location to the only witness alive who could put him at the scene, but wrong. He had been wrong to hope that. Cruz had eventually connected it. Perhaps it had taken him time to trace every person present that day. Perhaps someone had talked. It did not matter how. What mattered was that Cruz had come to the shop 1 week after William Hale's death with the smooth certainty of a man who has calculated his options and selected the one that costs him least. "He came for the ledger," she said. "Yes," Bram said. "Not because of any debt, because without it, his involvement in the murder of a federal marshal exists only in the testimony of witnesses, and witnesses can be managed. With it in his hands, he can destroy the only written record. With it in yours." Bram looked at her steadily. "He cannot allow that." Ira said, "And that is why you left Pittsburgh." It was not quite a question. She met his eyes. I left because of how he looked at me when I said I did not have the ledger. He did not believe me. And he looked at me the way a man looks at a problem he is planning to solve in the most efficient way available to him. She paused. My father told me two things before he died. He told me not to trust anyone who came to me using Cruz's name. And he told me that if Cruz himself came to the door, I should take what I needed and go. She looked down at the ledger on the table. I found the ledger that same night. I took it and I went. You answered Harlan's advertisement, Bram said. 2 weeks later. I was honest with the agency about my circumstances. I was not honest about my reasons for wanting to go as far west as quickly as possible. She kept her voice even. If I had been honest about that, they would not have placed me. Ira said nothing. Bram said nothing. The fire breathed. The men in Harlow Creek, Nell said, the ones asking about me, they are Cruz men. Yes, Ira said, and the ledger is the reason. Yes, she looked at both of them. I brought this to your house. You did not ask for it, and you did not know it was coming. I am sorry for that. Ira looked at her across the table for a moment. Then he said with the directness that was his characteristic mode of address, we will deal with it. He said it the way a man says a thing he has already decided, not a declaration, but a statement of fact as settled as the mountain outside. Harlan Fenn arrived home the following afternoon on a horse that had been pushed hard through difficult going, carrying the winter supply order in 2-pack bags and the particular set of jaw that meant he had been thinking about something the entire ride and had not yet finished thinking about it. He came through the door and stopped. Nell was at the table with harness leather and her father's tools working a repair on a badly cracked throat latch. Ira sat across from her with a coil of rope he was inspecting for fraying. They were not speaking. They had been not speaking for an hour in the particular way of two people who have found a silence they are both comfortable occupying, which is an entirely different thing from two people who have simply run out of words. Harlan read the room in the same efficient way he read weather and terrain and the temper of difficult animals. He read it in about 2 seconds. Then he hung his coat and hat and sat down at the table. He was a large man of 40, weathered and deliberate with the settled weight of someone who had been doing physical work all his life and had stopped noticing the weight because it had simply become part of what he was. His eyes were the same amber as Ira's, but darker, more guarded in the way they released information. Nell thought exactly what his letter had suggested. He was a man of thoroughness and quiet capability who did not make promises beyond what he could keep. She respected him immediately in the way you respect something well-made when you recognize the craft in it. She also knew with the uncomfortable clarity of someone who had been honest with herself for the past 12 hours that respect was not what she had begun to feel for his brother. Bram appeared from the back of the house and told the story. Harlan listened to all of it, the blizzard, the rescue, the sheriff's visit, the ledger, and what Bram had determined it contained the men in Harlow Creek asking questions about a woman matching Nell's description. He listened the way a man listens when he is building something in his mind, from the information arriving, organizing it into structural order, testing the weight of each piece before deciding where it fits. When Bram finished, Harlan looked at Nell. You knew something like this was possible when you answered the agency advertisement. Not an accusation. A statement precise and direct. She met his eyes. I knew men were looking for me. I knew I needed to go somewhere far enough and established enough that I might have some protection while I figured out what to do. The West seemed like a place where a woman with skills and a willingness to work could make something without having to explain her past every 5 minutes. A pause. I told the agency the truth about my circumstances. I did not tell them about Cruz, because they would not have placed you. That is correct. Harlan was quiet. She waited. You understand, he said, that this puts this property and my brothers at risk. I do. I am sorry for it. She kept her hands still on the table. If you want me to leave, I will understand and I will manage. You did not agree to this when you wrote to the agency. He looked at her for a long moment with those assessing eyes. Then he said, I did not say I wanted you to leave. I said it puts us at risk. He stood. Bram, show me those tracks Ira found. He went out. Bram followed. Remained at the table, and Nell remained at the table, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then she picked up the throat latch and her awl and went back to the work because the work was what was in front of her, and it needed doing, and working steadied her in a way that nothing else quite managed. Ira went back to his rope. That evening, long after Bram had gone to bed, Harlan and Ira stood in the barn in the kind of privacy that only a barn provides, close enough to be recalled by a shout, but far enough that words dissolved into the smell of hay and cold leather before they traveled anywhere. "She told you everything," Harlan said. "Most of it." Ira was checking a bridle, his hands moving through the routine of it without requiring much of his attention. Bram worked out the rest from the ledger. "And you believe her?" "She left things out, not because she was lying, because she has been careful for a long time, and careful people hold things back by habit." A pause. "But what she told us is true." Harlan put his hand on the top rail of the nearest stall and looked at it, the wood worn smooth by years of the same gesture. "I need to understand what I came home to Ira. You came home to your intended and to a problem she brought with her. The intended is more capable than the advertisement suggested. The problem is significant." Harlan was quiet for a moment. "And between the two of you while I was gone." Ira looked up. Harlan's expression was careful and measured, the same face he brought to difficult terrain and broken equipment, not angry, just reading. "Nothing happened," Ira said. "I know that. I am asking about the rest of it." The horses shifted in their stalls. Somewhere in the hay above them, something small moved through the dark. "She is your intended," Ira said. "I know that." "You do," Harlan agreed. And then, after a pause that lasted the length of 2 full breaths, "She came here for me, Ira." Ira said nothing, but the quality of his silence communicated something to the man who had known him for 36 years, and Harlan heard it the way you hear a thing that confirms what you already suspected but were not ready to name. He pushed off the railing. "We deal with Cruz first, then we figure out the rest." He walked back toward the house. Ira stood in the barn for a while after his brother left, in the dark and the cold and the smell of horses and leather, with his hand on the bridle and his eyes on nothing particular. 3 days passed in the rhythm of work and watchfulness that the ranch required. Nell settled into the daily life of the place with a naturalness that surprised her. She cooked and she cleaned and she worked on the harness and tack with skills that earned a genuine reaction from Eugenia Marsh, wife of the Harlow Creek General Store owner, who rode up on the 3rd day with fabric and the curiosity that was her distinguishing quality. Eugenia had come expecting whatever one expected of a mail-order bride from Pittsburgh, and had found instead a young woman already elbow-deep in a systematic repair of every piece of worn tack on the property, working with the tools and the focus of someone who had grown up inside the trade. She commissioned a repair on her husband's deteriorating stirrup leathers on the spot and went home to Harlow Creek with a revised understanding of the Fens situation. Bram worked alongside Nell through most of those days. He was easy company. Bram, his intelligence running sideways through problems, and his humor dry and unannounced, appearing without warning in the middle of sentences that had seemed to be going somewhere else. She liked him the way she imagined she might like a brother, a feeling she had never had occasion to develop before. He made the house feel inhabited in a way that 3 working men, for all their competence, apparently had not managed to do entirely on their own. Ira was the project she could not quite resolve. He was always there at meals and in the yard, and at the margins of whatever work needed doing, present in the complete and quiet way that was simply his way, not available through any of the ordinary social means she had learned. He did not respond to performance or pleasantry for its own sake. When she said something true, he paid attention. When she said something merely polite, he received it politely and moved on. She found herself saying fewer things merely polite, which she noticed and which she suspected he noticed also. On the morning of the 4th day, Ira found the tracks. 2 sets of hoof prints in the fresh snow on the south side of the property, circling from the tree line to the near fence and back, made some time in the night. He stood over them for a long time, with his hands in his coat pockets, reading them the way a former cavalry scout reads ground, which is to say, with a professional attention to what the evidence actually said rather than what he would have preferred it to say. Then he walked the line to where the tracks returned to the cover of the trees. Bram came up beside him. They crouched together over the impressions. "They were not moving fast," Ira said. "These are the tracks of men who stopped and stood here, looking at the house." Bram looked back toward the structure, the windows golden in the morning light. "How long ago?" "Late after midnight." Ira stood. "They know exactly where we are. Nell had come to the porch. She had heard the tone of the conversation without hearing the words. She looked at Ira across the yard, and he looked back at her, and no translation was needed. The following morning, two riders came to the front gate. They came in full daylight, which was either bold or calculated. Both Fenn brothers understood immediately that it was the second. Bold men announce their boldness. Calculated men wear boldness as a costume. The taller of the two rode ahead a man with a noticeable favor to his right leg and the careful dress of someone who wanted to look like he had legitimate business anywhere he happened to be. His face was constructed for looking reasonable. The second man was shorter, broad across the shoulders, his jaw set like a problem that had decided to remain unsolved. He stayed half a horse length back and said nothing and watched everything. Harlan walked out to meet them at the fence. He stopped there. He did not go through the gate. Ira positioned himself at the corner of the barn, which gave him a clear line of sight to all three men and to the tree line beyond. Bram had gone somewhere that no one was tracking, which meant he had found higher ground. The tall man drew his horse up and delivered his message in the pleasant manner of someone who had practiced it. They were riding for a man named Aldridge Cruz, a businessman of some reputation in Denver. They were looking to locate a Miss Nell Hale believed to be in the area. Mr. Cruz had a business matter to settle involving a personal ledger belonging to the late William Hale's estate, which was Cruz's property and ought to be returned. They were here in an entirely civil capacity to facilitate that return. Harlan said, "Do you have papers?" The tall man's pleasant expression remained exactly as it was. Papers. Legal documentation, something signed by a county magistrate establishing Mr. Cruz's claim to property from the Harper estate and authorizing its retrieval. "We are just here to have a friendly conversation, Mr. Fenn. If Miss Hale were to step out and confirm the ledger's ownership, we could all go about our business without any further inconvenience to anyone." Harlan said, "Come back with papers, properly executed. Until then, you have reached the edge of my property, and you have said what you came to say." The tall man looked past him. Nell was standing on the porch. She had not intended to be visible, but she had needed to see the men who were looking for her because a face attached to a threat was always better than a threat without a face. The tall man's eyes found her and performed the same calculation she had seen Cruz perform in the leather shop. That quick inventory, that assessment of value and use. She held his gaze. She did not look away. "We will be in touch, Mr. Fenn," the tall man said. He touched the brim of his hat, turned his horse, and rode back the way he had come. The broad-shouldered man followed without ever having spoken. Harlan stood at the fence and watched them go until the dust of their horses settled back to nothing. Then he turned and walked back to the house. On the porch, he stopped beside Nell and looked at the empty road. "That was Deke Salter," he said. "I have seen him in Harlow Creek. He works for a freight operation down south." He looked at her. "If he is working for Cruz now, that connection is worth knowing." "They will come back," she said. "They will come back," he agreed. That evening, Harlan called them all to the kitchen table. Nell told the full story this time, holding nothing back, including everything Bram had determined from the ledger, including the moment in the shop when she had understood that Cruz was not there about a financial claim. Harlan listened to all of it with his jaw set and his hands flat on the table. When she finished, he asked her directly, "Do you understand the full legal weight of what is in that ledger? What it means for Cruz if it reaches the right hands?" She looked at Bram. Bram said, "It means a federal murder charge. Killing a United States Marshal in the performance of his duties carries a mandatory sentence. There is no jurisdiction that handles it locally. A U.S. Marshal's office in Denver would send men to investigate. If the evidence is solid enough, which that ledger is, it goes to federal prosecution. Cruz cannot buy his way out of that the way he might buy his way out of a territorial court." Harlan absorbed this. Then the ledger is not just something he wants. It is something he needs. Without it, Nell said, the only evidence against him is a dead man's story. With it, the dead man testifies in federal court. She paused. And anyone who has read it and understood it becomes a witness, which is why he cannot simply wait. The silence that followed had the quality of a decision being formed. "She stays," Harlan said. Not to any of them specifically, just to the room as a fact he was establishing the same way you establish a fence line by driving the post deep and making sure it will not shift. "The ledger stays. We protect both." No one argued. No one had been going to argue. The fire breathed. That night, Nell lay awake again in the room with the new latch, listening to the house settle in the cold. She heard the brothers still up, two of them voices low enough that words did not carry, but tone did. Harlan's voice, then Ira's. She was not listening. She was simply not sleeping, and sound traveled in old log houses the way weather traveled finding the gaps. She heard Harlan say something that ended with the word mine. She heard Ira say something she could not make out. She heard Harlan again clearer this time because his voice had gone quieter in a way that somehow made it carry better. She came here for me, Ira. That is the fact of it. And then Ira low and without argument, but with a quality in the silence before the words that told her something she had not expected to be told. She came here to survive. That is different. A longer silence. Then Harlan's voice, again muffled now by distance or a closed door between rooms, and the rest was lost. Nell stared at the ceiling. Her heart was doing something irregular that had nothing to do with fear. She came here to survive. That is different. He had named the things she had not said to anyone, not to the agency, and not to Harlan, and not to Bram, and not to the mountain, and not to herself in the honest dark of her own mind, not entirely. She had come here to survive. That was the plain truth. She had been running when she answered the advertisement, not toward a life she had chosen freely, but away from a man who had stood in her father's shop and looked at her the way a man looks at a problem that needs solving. Ira Fenn had named this true thing without being told it from the evidence of one day in the same house. She turned onto her side and faced the wall and told herself very firmly that she had come to Colorado Territory to marry Harlan Fenn and to stop running and to build something real. And those were her objectives, and both were still achievable, and she was not going to complicate an already complicated situation by allowing herself to think about anything further. She lay very still. She did not sleep for another hour. Bram found her the following morning in the barn with the difficult mare that the Fenn brothers had largely stopped attempting. The horse had been standing quiet for 30 minutes with her head low and her eyes soft, Nell's hand moving in slow circles along the curve of her neck. Bram stood in the barn doorway and watched for a while before she heard him. "She has never done that for any of us," he said. "She does not like fast movements or loud sounds," Nell said. "She needs to decide on her own terms that you are safe. You cannot convince her. You have to wait." Bram came into the barn and sat on a hay bale with his elbows on his knees and looked at the mare with the expression of a man putting something together that he had seen in pieces. "May I ask you something directly?" Nell said. "That is my preferred kind of question. What was the arrangement exactly, the one Harlan made with the agency?" Bram was quiet for a moment, not in the way of someone deciding whether to answer, but in the way of someone choosing which true thing to lead with. "Harlan wrote to Weston 14 months ago. He is the oldest. He has always carried the weight of what this place is supposed to become. Not just the land and the livestock, a household, a future. He is practical about everything Harlan, and he applied the same practicality to this. He wrote a clear and honest letter about the conditions and what he could offer, and he waited. And Ira," Bram looked at his hands, "about as much as Ira ever says about anything that is not directly in front of him and requiring immediate action." He did not argue against it. He did not argue for it. He continued to be Ira. A pause, which means he kept working and kept his thoughts to himself and kept carrying this place on his shoulders the same as Harlan, just without needing to name what he was carrying. Nell ran her hand along the mare's neck. The mare's ear turned toward her, tracking her. "Has he ever—" she started and stopped. Bram looked at her with the particular attention of someone who knows exactly where a sentence was going. "There have been women in town over the years who would have been glad of his attention. He does not give it." He looked back at his hands. "I think he is the kind of man who does not want a thing unless he is certain of it. And it takes Ira considerably longer than most people to become certain." He stood and brushed hay off his trousers. "For what it is worth, I have watched him every day since you arrived. I have never seen him make coffee for anyone outside this family before." The mare leaned into Nell's hand. Bram walked back out of the barn without saying anything further. Nell stood with the animal in the quiet and thought about certainty and about how long it sometimes took, and about the difference between a thing you chose and a thing that chose you, and about her father's shaking hands circling a date in a ledger hidden in the back of a workbench, because he had witnessed something he could not report and could not forget and could not carry alone. She went to Harlan that afternoon. He was in the tack room with a broken rein. He was restitching, the kind of task that kept hands busy enough to permit honest conversation. She sat on the bench across the workbench from him. He did not stop working. She said she needed to tell him something true. She told him she was grateful for the advertisement and the honest letter and the shelter and for not sending her away when he learned the real reason she had come. She told him she recognized in him the kind of man the letter had suggested, honorable and fair and capable in ways that were not about performance. He said, but. She looked at her hands. I would not be a good wife to you, not because I am not willing to work or to build something here because I am genuinely, but because my honest self has begun pointing in a direction I did not choose and cannot simply correct. And you deserve better than a woman whose presence is complete in every practical sense, but absent in the one that matters. Harlan worked the thread through the leather. He pulled it taut. He cut it. He set the rein down on the workbench and looked at her with the careful assessing eyes that had read terrain and weather and difficult animals for 40 years. His face did something she had not seen it do before. Not hurt exactly. More like the expression of a man who has been watching something build for a while and has been waiting for it to be named. I know, he said. She waited. I knew when I came home, he said. You were at my table working, and Ira was across from you, and neither of you were saying anything. And the house felt different than it has felt in 7 years. He picked up another piece of harness and turned it in his hands. I am not a man who pretends things are other than what they are. Are you angry? A long pause. No. He set the leather down. Disappointed is not the right word either. It is more like when you plan to run a fence along the north slope and the ground tells you it needs to go elsewhere. That is not the ground's failing. It is just the shape of things. He looked at her directly. What would you like to do? I would like to deal with Cruz, she said. Everything else can wait until that is settled. She held his gaze. I am not going anywhere. I want you to know that. Whatever happens with the rest of it, I am not leaving. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, which was Harlan Fenn's way of saying a great many things at once. He went back to the harness. She stood to leave. Nell, he said without looking up. She stopped. For what it is worth, he said, and his voice was the voice of a man being very precise about something, you would have been worth it if the shape of things had been different. She went out of the tack room quickly before her face did something she did not want to explain. Bram rode into Harlow Creek that afternoon, ostensibly for a supply item that could have waited a week, but in truth to listen, which was one of his particular abilities. He had a talent for being present in a room without being the center of it, absorbing information through a quality of attention that looked like casual conversation from the outside. He came back at dusk with his horse blown and his expression stripped of its usual energy. He came into the kitchen where all three of them were. He sat down. He said, Aldridge Cruz rode into Harlow Creek this morning. Not Salter, not hired men, Cruz himself. He has taken a room at the Copperhead Hotel. He looked at each of them in turn. He has 6 riders with him. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from any that had come before it. The previous silences had been of the watchful kind, alert and sustainable. This one had the quality of something that had been named and could not be unnamed. 6, Ira said. 6, and Sheriff Prine is 3 days out on circuit. Bram looked at Nell. If those names in the ledger reach the federal marshal's office in Denver before Cruz reaches us, the calculation changes entirely. He cannot use 6 men against a federal investigation. He can only use them against us. Nell had already risen. She crossed to the shelf where the ledger rested and took it in both hands, holding it the way you hold something you have decided to use as a tool rather than to guard as a secret. I have been thinking about exactly that, she said quietly. She looked at the 3 of them. She looked at the ledger. She looked at the door and the dark beyond it and the mountain beyond that. And something settled in her that had been unsettled since March, since the knock at the shop door, since the circled date in her father's shaking hand. Tell me how fast a rider can reach Denver, she said. They talked through most of the night. Bram laid out what he knew of the federal marshal's process, the mechanics of how a report became an investigation, how a signed witness account with documentary evidence differed from an unsupported claim, how long the chain of authority took to move from a letter received in Denver to men on horseback riding toward Copper Ridge County. The answer was not quick. 2 days minimum for a rider to reach Denver. A week, perhaps more, before any federal response reached this altitude. Crews will not wait a week, Ira said. No, Harlan agreed. He came himself. That tells you something. He did not send Salter with 20 men and instructions to burn the problem down. He came himself with 6 riders, which is enough to be persuasive, but not enough to look like a military operation. He wants a quiet resolution, a transaction. He looked at Nell. He wants the ledger, and he wants your silence, and he wants to go back to Denver with both and wait for the whole thing to be forgotten. Nell had the ledger on the table in front of her. She had been looking at it for the past hour the way you look at something you have been carrying for a long time and are finally deciding what to do with. Then we take away the possibility of a quiet resolution, she said. If the information in this ledger is already out, the ledger itself stops being worth anything to him. He cannot unsend what has already been sent. He cannot make the marshal's office unread what we put in front of them. He still has 6 men, Bram said. He does. But 6 men cannot arrest a federal investigation. 6 men cannot unsay names that have already been said in front of witnesses. She looked around the table. If we say those names publicly here on this property, in front of people who are not his people, Cruz does not just lose a document. He loses the silence that makes him powerful. And a man like that, a man who has operated for years inside the silence, who depends on no one connecting what he does to who he is, that man does not fight a battle he has already lost. He calculates, and he goes. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Harlan said, "That is a risk." "Everything from here is a risk," Nell said. "This one puts the action in our hands instead of his." They argued the shape of it for another hour, finding the edges and testing them, working through the ways it could fail and what each failure would require. Harlan was methodical about the weaknesses. Ira said very little, but what he said was the kind of thing that clarified rather than complicated. If she is right about Cruz wanting a quiet outcome, the plan works. If she is wrong, you deal with what comes. It was the plain assessment of a man who had spent 3 years as a cavalry scout, learning that the most honest thing you could do in uncertain terrain was name the actual options and choose the one with the best odds, then commit to it completely. By the time the fire had burned down to coals and the cold had settled hard against the windows, the plan was set. Bram would ride before dawn. He would carry 2 sealed letters, one addressed to the United States Marshal's office in Denver and one to the Federal Land Office, both written in Nell's precise hand and annotated in Bram's with the legal context his year at the Denver office had given him. Every date in the ledger, every initial decoded, the circumstances of William Hale's original observation, his identity as a leather craftsman making a legitimate delivery, his decision to document what he witnessed and hide that documentation rather than report it to local authorities who could not be trusted to receive it safely. The initials AC connected to the full name Aldridge Cruz, the circled date, and the 3 words that followed it. He would also carry a list of names men in Copper Ridge County who had encountered Cruz operations in ways they might be willing to testify to if the right people asked the right questions with the right authority behind them. Bram had been building this list in his head since the night Nell opened the ledger on the kitchen table. Nell would write the letters. She would write them now tonight with the ledger open in front of her and her father's tools at her side, because having them nearby helped her think clearly in the way that familiar objects anchor a person to what is real. The others would sleep or try to, because tomorrow would ask things of them that exhausted men could not provide. Before dawn, she heard Bram's horse on the trail, the sound of it descending into the dark below the ranch, steady and deliberate, the hoofbeats of a horse that has been given a clear direction and a good rider behind it. She stood on the porch and listened until the sound was gone. Harlan stood beside her. The pre-dawn was absolute dark, the stars overhead, so dense and cold they seemed structural rather than astronomical, as though the sky were made of something and the stars were simply where the light got through. The mountains were invisible, except as the absence of stars on the horizon, a darkness that had mass and weight in its own particular silence. "He will make Denver by tomorrow evening if the road is clear," Harlan said. "I know." A long pause. The cold was the clean, dry cold of altitude at night, honest and complete. The cold of a place that has no interest in softening its nature for visitors. Nell, Harlan said. She looked at him. His face in the darkness was simplified to its essential lines, the jaw and the set of the eyes, and the particular quality of a man who has made up his mind about something and is now proceeding through the necessary steps of acting on it. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document, the formal kind, the kind that carried a letterhead and a seal, and set it on the porch railing between them. She looked at it but did not pick it up. The contract, he said, your placement with me, the formal arrangement the agency drew up. He looked out at the mountain dark. I am releasing it. She said nothing. This is not disappointment, he said with a deliberateness that told her he had been choosing these words for a while, measuring them the way he measured everything before he committed to it. You are everything the advertisement described and considerably more besides. The reasons are simpler than you might expect. He paused. You came here in a blizzard, and Ira rode into that blizzard to find you before I asked him to. I have known my brother for 36 years. I know what that means for him. He does not do things he does not mean. He picked up the document and held it a moment, looking at it with the clear eyes of a man performing an honest accounting of what a thing has been and what it has stopped being. I do not want a wife whose honest self is pointed elsewhere. And I do not want my brother spending the rest of his life looking sideways at his own house. That is not what I built this place for. Nell felt the precise and complicated weight of a moment in which someone does something genuinely generous at their own cost and does it without ceremony, because ceremony would make it about them rather than about the gift. She understood something about Harlan Fenn in that moment that she had not understood before, that his practicality was not the absence of feeling. It was the form his feeling took. The way he loved was by making things work, by seeing clearly what needed to be done and doing it without flinching, even when what needed to be done cost him. Are you certain? She asked. I do not do things I am not certain about, he said. It was a statement of fact, not pride offered the way you offer a fact about terrain. She picked up the contract. She held it. Thank you, she said. It was insufficient and also exactly right and also the only honest thing available. Harlan looked at the mountain dark for a long moment. Get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow we'll ask a great deal. He went inside. She stood on the porch alone with the folded contract in her hands, looking at the stars and thinking about her father, and about receipts, and about the shape of things that are freely given, and about what it cost a man to give them. He went to Ira that same night. Ira was in the barn awake, which Harlan had known he would be. He was doing something careful and quiet with a bridle, his hands moving through the task by the memory built into them, over thousands of repetitions, his mind somewhere else. Harlan stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he crossed to his brother and placed something in his hand. It was the key to the bedroom with the new latch, the one they had fitted for a woman's room. Ira looked at it. Harlan said 4 words. Do not waste it. He walked back to the house. Ira stood in the barn for a long time afterward in the dark, and the smell of horses holding the small weight of a key and the much larger weight of what it meant that his brother had put it there. In the morning, Nell asked him what Harlan had said. Ira looked at her steadily with those amber eyes that gave nothing and somehow always gave enough. He said not to waste it. She looked at the wall for a moment. When she looked back, he was still watching her, completely present, not pushing, not performing, simply there in the full and unhurried way that was his nature. She understood that this was what he offered, not declarations, not a man remade into something easier to receive, just himself, complete and honest and present in the way that certain things are present, a mountain, a fire, a current in deep water, real enough to navigate by. All right, she said. He nodded once. They went to make breakfast. Bram returned the following afternoon, and he did not return alone. He brought 2 men from the western end of the county, men Nell had not met. Drummond Fry was a compact, weathered rancher in his late 50s, precise in his speech, and deliberate in the way he moved a man who had learned to be sure of a thing before he said it. Lexton Webb was younger, late 30s, carrying a controlled anger that had clearly been with him a long time and had been managed rather than released, which made it denser and more purposeful than the unmanaged kind. Both men had lost family on the southern trade routes in the past 2 years. Drummond's older brother, a freight driver, had not come home from a run in the autumn of 1872. Lexton's father had disappeared the previous spring. In both cases, the local sheriff had recorded the disappearances, investigated minimally, and arrived at no conclusions. In both cases, the men they lost had been carrying freight along routes that passed through territory where Aldridge Cruz operated. When Bram showed them the relevant pages of the ledger, neither man spoke for a long moment. Drummond Fry traced one entry with a careful finger reading the date, the initials, the figure beside them. "I will stand as a witness to whatever is needed," he said. His voice was level and certain. "I have been waiting for something to stand for." Lexton Webb said the same in fewer words, with the particular economy of a man who has been holding something in for a long time and is only now beginning to believe there is somewhere useful to put it. Reverend Cornelius Doan had come with them, which had been Bram's specific thought. A minister who witnesses an event is difficult to accuse of having a stake in its outcome. Dane was spare and gray and had the quality that men develop after years of standing at bedsides and gravesides in difficult country, a fundamental lack of surprise at what people were capable of, the good and the bad of it. He had read Bram's account of the ledger on the road and asked two precise questions, and then ridden the rest of the way in the silence of a man who has understood what is being asked of him and has already decided his answer. "I will stand with you," he told Nell when she thanked him. "I have known Aldridge Cruz by reputation for 3 years. I did not know the specific character of his crimes until today, but I have known the character of the man." Nell looked at the people gathered in the kitchen of the Fenn Ranch on a November afternoon in Colorado Territory. 3 brothers, 2 men whose families Cruz had taken from them. A minister, a ledger written in her father's steady hand and finished in his shaking one. She thought about her father in the back of the shop on Millbrook Street, making beautiful things from rawhide with patient hands going about his careful life until one delivery on one spring afternoon had put him in a place where a federal officer died and a man gave orders and a delivery man from Pittsburgh was the only living witness outside the people who had made it happen. He had written it down. He had hidden it. He had carried the weight of it for a year and a month and died still carrying it. And the only thing he had managed to pass on was the ledger and 2 instructions in the pair of hands she was now using to make something of all 3. "Tell me when Cruz comes," she said. Aldridge Cruz arrived at the front gate of the Fenn Ranch at mid-afternoon. He came with 6 riders arranged in a loose formation behind him, the kind of arrangement that communicated capability without declaring intention, enough men to be serious, not enough to look like an army. He rode a fine gray horse and wore a coat that suggested Denver rather than the trail. His slight favor to the right leg was visible as he dismounted, one foot finding the ground differently than the other, controlled and habitual, a man long accustomed to managing what he could not change. His face was the same face Nell had seen in the leather shop on Millbrook Street, composed, reasonable on its surface, the small eyes moving with their constant inventory, cataloging the yard, the positions of the men visible, the structure of the house, the distances between things. He saw Harlan at the fence and Ira at the barn corner, and Drummond Fry and Lexton Webb standing near the side fence post. He had expected a rancher and perhaps a bowman. He had not expected witnesses. His expression did not change. That was the thing about calculated men. Their faces did not update in real time. "Mr. Fenn," he said, his voice carrying the pleasant tone of a man conducting legitimate business. "I appreciate the assembly. I hope we can resolve this efficiently." "Say what you came to say," Harlan told him. Cruz reached inside his coat and produced a folded letter. "I have correspondence from a Pittsburgh attorney establishing my claim to certain business records belonging to the estate of the late William Hale. Those records, specifically a personal ledger maintained during a business arrangement between Mr. Hale and myself, are my property. I am here to retrieve them." He paused with the small pause of a man giving someone room to respond reasonably. "If Miss Hale will step out and confirm the ownership, we can complete a simple transfer and part ways without further inconvenience to anyone." "The letter is from a private attorney in Pittsburgh," Harlan said. "It has no standing in Colorado Territory. Come back with documentation from a territorial or federal court. Until then, you are standing at the edge of my property and you have delivered your message." Cruz looked past him. The porch door opened. Nell came out. She had thought about this moment carefully, not with the feverish repetition of anxiety, but with the methodical attention her father had taught her to bring to any task that required both precision and nerve. She had thought about it the way she thought about a difficult repair, Find the center of the problem, understand what the material will and will not do, work with the nature of the thing rather than against it. Cruz's strength was the assumption that she would be frightened, that she would be a 19-year-old girl from Pittsburgh, standing alone on a porch in the Colorado mountains, running out of options and very far from home. That assumption was his plan, and his plan depended on it remaining accurate. She was not going to perform courage. She was simply going to be accurate. She carried the ledger in both hands, held plainly the way you hold something you have decided to use. She walked to the edge of the porch and stood there in the afternoon light and looked directly at Aldridge Cruz. He looked back. The inventory in his small eyes ran its calculation. "Mr. Cruz," she said, "Miss Hale." He almost achieved a smile. "You have caused me considerable inconvenience." "I apologize for the inconvenience," she said. "I will not apologize for the cause of it." She held the ledger up, not dramatically but clearly, so that every man in that yard could see it. "I know what is in this book. My father's record of a business arrangement, yes. Also his record of every meeting, every payment, every man present at a specific location on April 14th of last year. Written in his hand, signed with hidden initials." She kept her voice level and her words clear audible to everyone in the yard and beyond it. "I also know what left this property 2 days ago before your men began watching our fence line." Cruz was very still. "A complete account of this ledger's contents," she said. "Every date, every initial, every transaction, and a detailed description of what William Howell witnessed on the 14th of April, 1872, was dispatched by separate riders to the United States Marshal's office in Denver and to the Federal Land Office, written out by hand and signed by me as the daughter and sole heir of the witness." She paused. "By now, someone in Denver has read it." Something moved in Cruz's eyes. The inventory was still running, but the calculations were different now, arriving at results he had not planned for. She continued, "You came here for this ledger. I understand that. Without it, your involvement in the death of Marshal Raymond Calder exists only in the memory of witnesses. With it, my father testifies in writing in a federal court. But here is what you did not account for." She set the ledger down on the porch railing in front of her and kept one hand on it. "The ledger is no longer the only record. Taking it changes nothing about what is already on a desk in Denver. Taking me changes nothing either." She looked past Cruz to his 6 riders. "Whatever you needed that book to keep quiet is no longer quiet." The yard was still enough that the wind in the spruce was clearly audible. Drummond Fry's voice came from the side fence, steady as a post-driven deep. "My brother drove freight on the southern route in the autumn of 1872. He did not come home. I will say that in front of any court that asked me." Lexton Webb beside him. "My father disappeared on the same route the following spring. I have documentation of his last known location. I have been waiting for someone to ask." Reverend Cornelius Dane stood at the far edge of the porch and said nothing at all. He did not need to. A man of his position standing in that spot as a witness to what was being said was its own kind of testimony, the kind that was very difficult to make disappear. Cruz sat on his gray horse and looked at the assembled people and the ledger on the railing and the mountain rising above the ranch house and the clear Colorado sky behind all of it. He was a man who had operated inside silence for years, who had built his power on the certainty that no single person had enough of the picture to put it together usefully. He was looking at a yard full of people who had pieces of the picture and a woman who had put those pieces together, and a ledger that had already done its work before he arrived to prevent it. The youngest of his 6 riders moved his horse. He did it quietly without announcement, simply angling the animal toward the road in the way of a man who has completed his private arithmetic and found the answer unsuitable. He rode, not fast, just away. One of the others followed, then a third. Cruz sat with 3 men remaining at the gate and looked at Nell for a long moment, with the eyes of a man who has encountered a problem he did not expect and is deciding how to characterize the encounter to himself. He said with a steadiness she had to grant him, "This is not finished." "The part of it that involves coming to this ranch is finished," she said. "The rest of it belongs to the federal court." He turned his horse. He rode. The 3 remaining men fell in behind him, and they went south toward the Harlow Creek Road, and the dust their horses raised hung briefly in the afternoon air, and then settled back into the stillness and the yard was quiet with the particular quiet that follows the departure of something that has been threatening for a long time and is now gone. Bram's voice came from the roof of the barn where he had been stationed since before crews arrived. I was not entirely certain that was going to work. Get down from the roof, Harlan said. I need a moment. I want to enjoy this from an elevated position. It worked because she was right, Ira said. He walked from the barn corner to the porch. He stopped at the foot of the steps and looked up at Nell. She was still standing at the railing with one hand on the ledger and the other at her side, and the afternoon light was on her face, and she looked like a person who has done the thing she came to do and is only now beginning to feel the full weight of what it cost her to get there. Are you all right? He asked. She looked at the empty road. She looked at the ledger under her hand. She thought about a shop on Milburn Street and a workbench with a hollow back and a careful man who had carried something impossible for a year and a half and had not been able to put it down in time. Yes, she said. He nodded once. He went to see to the horses, which was the right thing to do, and she watched him go and understood that this too was him, this returning to the work. When the immediate crisis had passed, this refusal to make more of a moment than the moment required. Some men would have made a speech. Ira Fenn went to see about the horses, and she found that she trusted that absolutely. Sheriff Luther Prine arrived the following morning, his horse hard-ridden, and his expression already organizing itself into the practical shape of a man who has come to find something resolved that he had been riding hard to prevent. He spent 2 hours at the kitchen table with Drummond Fry and Lexton Webb and the ledger, listening to everything and asking precise questions and writing things down in a notebook with the professional thoroughness of a man building something that would hold up later. Before he left, he told Nell that men from the federal marshal's office in Denver would want her testimony probably within the fortnight and that she should plan to be available for it. She said that was entirely acceptable. Aldridge Cruz was taken into federal custody 17 days later at a hotel in Pueblo, Colorado, where he appeared to have been conducting a careful assessment of his future options, which the arrival of federal marshals simplified considerably. The case that followed involved courts and testimony and the slow grinding machinery of federal prosecution, and Nell followed it in the newspapers when they came up from Harlow Creek and then stopped following it and then decided she did not need to follow it at all. It had moved beyond her. It had become something the law was carrying now, and the law was large enough to carry it without her. The part that had been hers to carry, she had set down on a porch railing on a November afternoon, and she did not intend to pick it up again. They were married on a Thursday. Harlan had ridden to town 3 days after the confrontation and spoken with Reverend Dane, who agreed without requiring any particular explanation of the circumstances. The Reverend had seen enough of the Fenn family in the preceding week to understand the general shape of things, and he was not a man who required circumstances to be simple before he was willing to proceed. It was a clear morning, cold without being brutal. The kind of day that the Colorado high country produced occasionally in late November, as a gesture of goodwill after weeks of difficulty, the sky achieving a blue so complete it seemed almost architectural. They stood in the ranch yard. Nell wore the best of the dresses she had brought from Pittsburgh, the deep blue wool one brushed clean and mended at the hem where the blizzard had torn at her father's small garnet brooch at the collar. It was the brooch she had worn to her father's funeral, and to every significant occasion she could remember a small red anchor, the last of the shop on Millbrook Street, that she carried on her person. Ira stood in a clean shirt and his good coat, the one that fit him correctly, which she had discovered the day before while helping reorganize the tack room, and had brought to him without ceremony, holding it up and waiting for him to put it on. He had stood in it in the kitchen while she assessed the fit and said it would do. He had looked down at himself briefly and said that he knew. The ordinary straightforwardness of this had produced something in her chest that took a moment to identify as happiness, which she had not felt in simple and ambiguous form since before her father began to be frightened. Harlan stood as witness on Ira's right side, straight-backed, composed, fully present in the way that was his particular quality, the way of a man who has decided to do something and does it without reservation. Whatever the past weeks had cost him, he had paid it and was still standing, which she had come to understand was the fundamental Harlan Fenn mode of existence. Bram stood on Ira's left. He had been holding himself together since Reverend Dane began speaking, which lasted until approximately the third sentence, after which something in his face gave way in the direction of deep feeling that he would spend the rest of the day pretending had not happened and which fooled no one. Dane's words were plain and meant. He did not require rings. He required that people say clearly what they intended and mean what they said. Ira's voice making the promises was what it always was. Low and certain and precise, nothing in it that was not true. Nothing wasted. She felt it the way you feel a thing that has weight rather than just sound. When her turn came, she said the words back to him steadily and meant every one of them, including the ones that reached past the present moment, into the long, uncertain future, which were the ones that required the most of her, and therefore the ones that mattered most. The Reverend said they may proceed. Ira looked at her. She looked at him. He leaned in and kissed her gently, the way he did everything with complete attention. And without performance, the way a man who does not do things he does not mean does the things he means. Bram produced a sound that was theoretically a clearing of the throat. Harlan stepped forward and took Nell's hand and held it for a moment. Nothing was said. She pressed his hand back. There were no words available for what passed between them in that moment, and neither of them would have wanted to use words for it anyway. She thought you are going to be all right. She thought he heard it because his grip tightened briefly and then released. Drummond Fry and Lexton Webb had ridden up for the occasion since they had been part of what made it possible. They stood at the fence and produced the heartfelt appreciation of men who have witnessed a good outcome arrived at through stubbornness and honesty in roughly equal measure, both of which they held in high regard. Eugenia Marsh from the general store had learned of the occasion through means that no one entirely tracked and had arrived with a pie because she was constitutionally unable to appear at any significant human event without one. The afternoon ended with everyone on the porch in the thin November sun, eating apple pie and drinking coffee and talking about nothing in particular, which was the best way for it to end. The weeks that followed had the particular quality of earned quiet. No riders appeared at the fence line at night. No hoof prints circled the property in fresh snow. The mountain was simply the mountain again, large and cold and honest, asking nothing of the people at its base except their best work and receiving it without comment. Nell's leatherwork had created its own trade before she had organized it into one. Ranchers from across the county had begun finding their way to the Fenn property with worn tack and failed stitching drawn first by Eugenia Marsh's description and then by the visible results of what had already been repaired. The income was modest but real and entirely hers, which mattered in a way she had not anticipated until it existed. Her father's tools on the workbench in the tack room, her hands doing what his hands had taught hers, something of him continuing in a place he had never seen. She wrote to the Weston Matrimonial Agency in early spring, a brief and careful note explaining that the arrangement had concluded differently than originally structured, but satisfactorily by all parties involved. She imagined the agent reading this several times in an attempt to understand it, and found she did not mind the confusion she was causing. Bram had found his way toward Margaret, a schoolteacher in Harlow Creek, with opinions as precise as his own, and a complete disinterest in being impressed by anything he said, which suited him better than admiration would have. He rode down the mountain more often now, and returned with the slightly preoccupied expression of a man who is working on something more complicated and more interesting than anything he had previously attempted. Harlan had begun building. He had selected a site on the upper ridge above the tree line with a long view east over the mountains to a horizon that went on considerably further than most horizons. He said he wanted his own space, which everyone understood to mean that he was providing them with theirs, and no one said anything about it because some forms of generosity are best received without comment. He came to the main house twice a week for supper and brought himself fully when he came. He seemed in the manner of men who have made a difficult and correct decision and have made their peace with it to be moving toward something rather than away from one. Not quickly, but in the deliberate forward way that was the only way Harlan Fenn had ever moved toward anything. She respected it. She told him so once in passing on an evening when the others were elsewhere. He had looked at the ridge above and said he expected he would find his way to whatever it turned out to be. She believed him completely. On a late May evening, Ira came to find her in the yard. She was with the chickens, which had become her particular jurisdiction in the way that small domestic territories become someone's jurisdiction by consistent occupation, until ownership stops being a question. The chickens had names. She had not announced this. Ira had heard her using them through the kitchen window, and had said nothing about it, which was his way of accepting a thing without needing to make it a subject. He stood at the edge of the yard and looked at her. The evening light was doing what Colorado evening light did in May, apologizing for everything the preceding months had required by producing something extraordinary, long and golden and specific, falling across the yard and the barn and the fences in a way that made everything look considered rather than weathered. She looked up and met his eyes. He said, "Come here." She came. She stood beside him and looked in the direction he was looking, which was the ranch. The barn and the house and the garden Brabham had expanded through the spring, and the fence lines running out to the tree line and the creek glinting in the low light below. The mountain rising above all of it, still carrying snow and the high places green everywhere below the snow line, the air carrying pine and cold water, and the particular clarity that this altitude produced a sense of being able to see exactly as far as things actually were. She looked at all of it with him. He said, "I have been thinking." She waited. With Ira, waiting was always the right response. "Before you came," he said, "I used to stand in this yard in the evenings and think this was what peace was. The quiet, the work done, everything in its place." She said, "And now?" He looked at her, those amber eyes that had been steady since the first moment she had seen them crouching in the snow, next to where she had sat down, steady and direct and completely present, and asking nothing of her but honesty in return. "Now I know the difference," he said, "between quiet and inhabited." She did not say anything. She reached over and took his hand, large and calloused and warm from a day of work, and held it. They stood in the evening light together and looked at what they had. The mountain held them the way it held everything here, without preference or sentiment, simply with the permanence of things that are larger than the events that occur in their presence. The light moved across the yard the way light moved imperceptibly and then all at once. Somewhere below the ridge, Harlan's hammer rang against timber as he worked on his cabin. In the last of the daylight, the sound of a man building something with his own hands that would belong to him alone, steady and certain and without complaint. Nell thought about a leather shop in Pittsburgh and a hollow back in a workbench, and her father's careful hands making beautiful things until fear made them careful in a different way. She thought about the cold on the open slope below the Fenn Ranch trail and the sound of hooves in the snow, and a man crouching in front of her without hesitation in the middle of a blizzard. She thought about a porch railing and a ledger set down at last and names spoken out loud in clear mountain air to people who would carry them where they needed to go. She thought about the kind of thing you spend your whole life carrying without knowing you are carrying it until the moment you put it down, and how the absence of it is its own particular discovery. She held her husband's hand in the last light of a Colorado evening and felt the mountain around her and the work of the place and the real and solid weight of a life that was hers now entirely and finally with nothing pursuing her through it. The light held as long as it could. Then it went the way all light eventually goes, not suddenly, but by degrees, the gold warming to copper and the copper darkening toward the blue hour, the stars beginning to show through in ones and twos above the eastern peaks. She was home, not the home she had planned, or the home she had run toward, or the home she had tried to construct from the careful language of a stranger's honest letter. Something more unplanned and more durable than any of those. The kind of home that does not announce itself to anyone that you have to earn, that sits at the end of a trail that winds upward through difficulty and asks everything of you before it shows you what it is. The kind that holds in all weather for all the years that the work and the honesty and the people who build it together have to give it. The chickens settled for the night. The hammer on the ridge went quiet. The mountain breathed its cold, clean breath across the yard, and the man beside her tightened his hand around hers, once the way he did everything without ceremony and without doubt, and she thought her father would have liked him very much. She thought he would have said that a man's character is what he does when there is no rule telling him what to do. And she thought he would have said that Ira Fenn had answered that question in a blizzard before she even knew his name.